Why use a watercolor sketchbook? It's a great way to gather quick paint studies or ideas to learn more about watercolor. Out of all of my sketchbooks, I have the largest number of watercolor sketchbooks. They can also be called watercolor journals. And really, it's because my goal is to improve as a watercolorist, specifically with the ink and wash method. Hi, Maria here from My Art Pixie, and let's talk sketchbooks. For the past few weeks, I have been talking about different kinds of sketchbooks, and this week we're going to specifically talk about watercolor sketchbooks. A watercolor sketchbook is great in using wet mediums and a few dry. Let me explain. It's great for watercolor paints and gouache paints, but it's also great if you want to use graphite pencil to put down a little sketch of what you're going to paint, or fine liners to do the ink and wash method or techniques. There are also two different kinds of watercolor paper. There's cold press paper, which has a rough surface, and hot press paper that has a smooth surface. Both hold water very well. And you can use colored pencils or watercolors on either cold or hot press. But the great thing about hot press is that you can use your fine liners, know that they're not going to be damaged, and then you can add some watercolor because the paper is still going to hold that wet medium. I have used the fine liners on the cold press as well. I just know that sometimes my fine liners might get roughed up a little bit because of the rough paper, but I'm okay with that. Another thing to keep in mind when you're purchasing fine liners to work within your watercolor sketchbooks or watercolor journals, you want to make sure that you have waterproof fine liners. It should say pigment ink for waterproof fine lines. If it's not waterproof, then the ink could smudge. So super important. Watercolor painting is often viewed as the most intimidating medium. Watercolor painting in general takes a great deal of patience and an even greater understanding of how it reacts with water, paper, and pigment. For some artists, it's overwhelming. A watercolor sketchbook or a watercolor journal for an artist is great because then that artist can focus on not only a smaller page, but on certain techniques within that page. They can test and discover watercolor and what it feels like to use it, what it feels like to use the brushes, what it feels like to use wet on wet technique or wet on dry technique. And it's less overwhelming to work on these pages than on a much larger project. The goal is to learn, mess up, and try new things. And a watercolor sketchbook is perfect for that. I have collected so many watercolor journals over the years to explore different techniques and also teach different techniques to other people who want to learn how to use watercolor as well. I teach using a watercolor journal so that the students don't feel so overwhelmed. And once they become comfortable, or I should say more confident with their watercolor skills, then they can move on to larger projects, larger pieces of watercolor paper. I have used different sizes of watercolor sketchbooks as well, especially because I love to take my watercolor sketchbooks on the go. And they are just perfect to fit inside my bag with my watercolor kit that has my water brush in it, and I can go out and explore things beyond the boundaries of my studio, and I absolutely love that. I love doing urban sketches, and also sketching out in the countryside, or finding a park that I can sketch in as well using my watercolor paints. And I usually always take a fine liner with me so that I can do some ink and wash techniques as well. So watercolor sketchbooks on the go, to me, is just invaluable, because you can not just draw and sketch outside of your studio, but you could also paint outside of your studio as well. I also really enjoy the smaller sizes so that I can get good small studies if I want to do just a certain technique, or if I want to focus on just a smaller, something that's more detailed. I just love that smaller size, and how you can, work on different techniques. Like, for example, here I worked on some wood grain techniques. And then here's another study that I worked with some pen and ink on top of it. So just working in that smaller size, and experimenting and discovering along the way. I have also created some handmade watercolors. I've also sold them on Etsy. I just sold out of all of my handmade watercolor journals last week. Thank you for everyone who purchased one. They were so popular that I'm thinking about making some more. So if you're interested in something like that, let me know in the comments below. But I have really enjoyed creating these disc-bound watercolor journals, so that I have my own watercolor journals to use with different things. This one here is specifically for gouache. I only want to use gouache paint inside of it, so that I can really get used to gouache and learn how to use that more properly, so that I can hone in and get better at using gouache and improve my skills. So you can really make one if you want it specific to a certain study that you're trying to do, or something that you're trying to discover, or a technique that you're trying to get better at. Last, I just want to say that I love the ink and wash process. And watercolor journals have just made that more possible for me. I don't feel like I have to work on this huge project. I can just work on ink and wash, urban sketches and things like that, and use my fine liners, my waterproof fine liners within my sketchbook, and I can get some really great sketches within my watercolor sketchbook. But then on top of that, I can add the color to it, which to me brings it alive. And I love to explore with different colors and just really capturing what I'm seeing outside of my studio. I have several videos on my channel that I specifically work with my watercolor sketchbooks. So if you want to go check those out, I have a whole playlist available for watercolor sketchbooks. I would definitely go check those out if you want to learn a little bit more. I also have a great one about my sketchbook theory if you want to go check that out too. And until next time, bye!